Even if I'm adding apples, are two apples the same? No, they're always, that's a variance we're talking about. So I can, if I define my set properly, this is set theory. Remember that stuff you had in the, well, you guys may not have, but every kid that I remember had set theory. That was the first chapter in every math book that every kid hated. Maybe your kids had it in there. But you should have had set theory, because set theory is the basis for all mathematics, for all all mathematical systems based in set theory. So the problem is defining your set. If you define your set big enough, I guess we could add them all together, right? But the problem in the real world is no two things are the same. So does 1 plus 1 ever equal 2? In the real world, 1 plus 1 equals 1 plus 1. You get it? If I define my set correctly, I could add things together, but that's the point. I have to define a set in reality to make it match reality. So all the equations, like I can draw you an equation that's beautiful for dropping this, for acceleration, velocity, and everything. But guess what? This will never exactly follow that equation. The equation is perfect. The real world is not. That's what logic, that's the difference between logic and these methods. Because these methods are used to prove in the real world, where mathematics and logic is used to prove in a fictional construct, which is, well, anyway. We have 3 criteria that we use to judge the accuracy of any written historical evidence. And that's what we're talking about in this class, right? Written historical evidence. That's the Gospels. They're written historical evidence. So we use these 3 tests: bibliographical, internal, and external proof. In any document, now when I teach other documents in antiquity, when I teach about any of the Greek documents, when I teach about any of the documents written, I usually only do Greek, but sometimes I'll do Hebrew stuff. When I talk about any documents in antiquity, Book of the Dead, for example, for the Egyptians, I always use this method. I always prove the veracity of the text before we talk much about the text. You got to prove it if you're going to accept it. So, if a work in antiquity passes all 3 tests, the source is considered indisputable, unless it's contradicted by a source of greater degree or merit. Okay? It's always considered indisputable if it passed these tests. Some people ask me this question. I've been having this discussion with a fellow. They asked me this question: well, what about miracles? What about odd things that we see in the documents that don't make sense to us in the modern world? The answer is, you have to accept them from a historical basis, because number one, most of you are probably only familiar with the New Testament documents as documents in antiquity, right? If you read any document in antiquity, guess what they attributed things to all the time? To gods and miracles. That's right. You find Caesar talking about miracles. You find Josephus talking about miracles. You see Herodotus and Theodocles. All the writers in antiquity only saw the world through their worldview. And in their worldview, what could there be? Gods and miracles, right, and fake. So it's amazing. People have such a great knowledge of New Testament documents, for example. And so I always hear it all the time. Well, you can't accept the historicity of the New Testament documents because they have miracles in it. You're like, well, are you going to not accept the historicity of Josephus or Theodocles or Herodotus or whoever, Pliny or Caesar, because they mention miracles too? What's good for one is good for the other. You got to accept. That's why I say, a historian does not evaluate the eyewitness of an eyewitness and say, well, you're a nuthead because you're speaking from your culture, from your ideas, from what you think you saw. Just like in a court of law. Now, the prosecuting attorney might take it to effect, but in a court of law, let's say we're in a courtroom about a UFO that a guy saw. So he says, I saw this happen, right? You can take it or leave it for what you believe, but this is my witness in a court of law. Somebody might question him back and forth, and that's the prosecuting attorney or, you know, whatever. But does that negate the witness? No, the witness still stands. Now, if the guy's a nuthead anyway, I mean, that's a different question. The problem is that when you get in history, when you have something that passes the test, it's just considered undisputable unless you get another source that says it didn't happen. So, for example, I have, you know, Caesar says, I saw a miracle in Germania from so-and-so, right? Unless I have another source that says, well, I saw Caesar and he was there and there was no miracle. This lady just did a fake thing and, you know, had a puff of smoke in her hand from fireworks, which weren't invented at the time, right? Unless I have another witness that has a greater degree than the witness to Caesar's view of that miracle, then what? Caesar's eyewitness stands in history. And as a historian, all I can say is this is what Caesar saw, right? And then we let the other people handle it, you know, in terms of, well, you know, that's one of the things historians do. It's called deconstructing history. It's called constructing history. It's where you try to understand culturally what the people are talking about. And a lot of that's what I do in my classes, try to understand what it's really saying in the documents. In any case, when we talk about degree and merit, merit refers to how well the work passes the 3 evidentiary tests. So we have the 3 evidentiary tests. If I have a document that passes it better than another, it's called the merit of the document. The degree of the document is primary, secondary, tertiary, none, although sometimes I talk about quaternary. There's no such thing, but that's okay. A primary degree witness is what kind of witness? An eyewitness. So you guys are all eyewitnesses to see me, and if you wrote an account today of what you saw, you would be eyewitnesses. Now, what's a secondary witness? Yeah, we call it a hearsay evidence. But it's, okay, if you went out of the classroom and someone said to you, what did Dr. Alford talk about today? And you then told them what went on in the class, that person is now a secondary witness. Generally, we talk about secondary witnesses as being newspapers, for example. Newspapers, magazines, because what are good reporters supposed to do?
Report what they saw.
Well, they may not see it, but they report the eyewitness account of someone who did. So if they did see it, like, you know, the reporter that saw the Hindenburg, they're an eyewitness account, right? But generally, reporters just don't make it in time. So they have to rely on the eyewitness accounts, and that's why we have this thing called a secondary witness, second-hand witness. Now, what's a tertiary witness? Well, I told you. A tertiary witness is someone who never saw the event and never talked to an eyewitness to the event. So guess what most documents in antiquity are? Matter of fact, guess what all those history books they made you read when you were in college and high school and wherever? Tertiary. I'm going to tell you something. You still need to read my books, okay? Because I try to take all the primary and secondary witnesses for you and boil them down into something that's fun to read. That's what I do as a historical writer. But guess what? That's a tertiary witness. When I study history, what do you think I study? I study primary and secondary witnesses. The best I can. See, the problem in antiquity, there's not a lot of them. But the ones you have, that's what you want. And historians, what do historians study? Primarily.
Secondary.
Well, they want to study, okay, if you're a historian, what do you do first? What are you looking for first? Primary. What are you looking for second?
Secondary.
And what are you looking for third?
Tertiary.
That's why they're called primary, secondary, and tertiary. Because the point is that as a good historian, if you really want to know what happened, you don't rely on what somebody reports that somebody else reported that was reported. You go for the what did someone see first, and secondarily, what was the report from what someone who really saw it was. Do you see this? It's really important. Because in a court of law, we usually don't allow, what's the only witnesses we allow used in a court of law? Primary. Yeah, which, well, can be considered an expert witness to a degree. But a primary witness to a crime or to an event, right? Secondary is called hearsay evidence. And tertiary isn't allowed. But guess what everybody studies when they study history? Tertiary. Now, the reason I have a quaternary, usually I talk about none, but this is opinion. Most works in antiquity are not histories. Remember I talked about pagan worldview? In a pagan worldview, what are you interested in? The gods, right?
How something happened.
And what do you think caused it to happen?
Gods.
The gods. Does it matter what happened? Does it matter that humans were involved in what happened? Matter of fact, the invention of the legal historical method is really attributed directly to Theodocles. What did Theodocles write about in Greek? Do you remember what he wrote about? He was the guy that gave you the 300? The Spartans, 300 Spartans, remember, that were fighting Xerxes? That came through the pass? Thermopylae? Remember that? They made a movie out of it, the Spartans. He's the guy who wrote about that. He wrote about it like 300 years after it occurred, I believe. But he wrote about it, and he writes in the beginning, in his preface, I'm writing about this so that it won't be forgotten in human and the history of the gods. He's the first guy to think that writing down what humans did was important. Herodotus wrote the same thing. Because in the Greek worldview, which was moving from pagan to rational worldview, in a rational worldview, what is important in the world?
People did.
What people did. Because who cares what the gods did, right? What mattered was what people did. And so that's where we get the invention of the legal historical method, to report what happened in history. And so even then, Herodotus is known for looking for primary, one of the reasons he's considered in that group, he wrote later than Theodocles. But the big deal was he was trying to sort out what a primary witness was, what a secondary witness was, and what a tertiary witness is. And so all of this was because the Greeks were moving from a pagan worldview to a more rational worldview. And that's what everything fits together here, right? In any case, the first test we use is called the bibliographical test. Bibliographical has nothing to do with the Bible. It's like a bibliography. What is a bibliography? A listing of works that are used in reference, right? The bibliographical test is a reference, is in reference to not a Bible, but rather to the reference works. And so the bibliographical test specifically is an examination of how the document was transmitted to us in time. This is the first test we use. We have two parts of the test. The first is number of manuscripts. The more manuscripts I have, and what is a manuscript? A manuscript is a handwritten copy, because until Gutenberg in the 1400s invented the printing press, everything was handwritten. So usually I'll give you this too. When we talk about in antiquity, when is antiquity? Antiquity is circa before 600 AD.
Oh.
The reason for that is because, and I think I mentioned, yeah, I do. No originals from any work in antiquity exists. No originals from any work in antiquity exists. So at what point do we begin to have original works? About 600 AD. As a matter of fact, the one that we have is the Quran. The Quran is one of the latest or earliest documents we have where we know we have an original of the manuscript. It may not be the exact original that was, and by the way, Muhammad was illiterate, so he related it to the person who wrote it down. But we may not have that original copy, but we believe we have at least a copy that is very, very close to that. So in antiquity is usually around 600 AD, and everything before that, everything before 600 AD is in antiquity.